How and why I pray. Prayer for much of my adult life has been about experiencing God through church liturgy and music. God was made real through the communal act of praise, love, and expression of gratitude, something that Colleen and I shared for most of our marriage. Before her death in 2015 and soon after, I continued my faith journey by exploring Buddhism and mystical traditions in and outside the church. The mystical faith perspective, often referred to as the wisdom tradition, has deep roots in not only early Christianity, but also other major faith traditions. Franciscan priest Richard Rohr is a major modern thought and faith leader in this space, and the late Father Thomas Keating is the modern leader who revived and refined the centering prayer practice, which is also aligned with the wisdom tradition. Cynthia Bourgeau, an Episcopal priest, is another contemporary leader in both the mystical perspective and the actual practice of centering prayer. My meeting Bill Redfield, a former priest in this diocese, and attending several of Bill's retreats after Colleen died, deepened my understanding of the wisdom tradition, centering prayer, and other related prayer practices. As a side note, Skip Adams, when he was rector at St. James in the late 1990s, taught many types of prayer in his adult education class. Centering prayer was one of them, but I just didn't fully appreciate its power and meaning at the time. Centering prayer is now the central way that I pray. More times in a group than by myself, I practice centering prayer multiple times a week. The structure is straightforward in 4 parts as I practice it on my own and in the St. James Centering Prayer Group. The first part is a few minutes of grounding and focusing on the breath as a way to begin to come into the present, clear the mind, and become heart-centered. This is where we set our intention to be quiet with God, to be totally open to God. The second part is a brief reading of an inspiring narrative or poem that connects us with God, nature, the universe, love of others, our true selves, gratitude, and joy. Sources cross numerous boundaries from the Bible to Buddhism to Sufism to secular readings. One of my favorite readings is Stripped by God by Cynthia Langston Kirk. What would happen if I pursued God, if I filled my pockets with openness, grabbed a thermos half full of fortitude, and crawled into the cave of the Almighty, nose first, eyes peeled, heart hesitantly following until I was face to face with the raw, pulsing beat of mystery? What if I entered and it looked different than anyone had ever described? What if the cave was too large to be fully known, far too extensive to be comprehended by one person or group, too vast for one dogma or doctrine? Would I shatter from such a thought, perish from paradox or puzzle, shrink and shrivel before the power? Would God be diminished if I lived a question rather than a statement? Would I lose my faith as I discovered the magnitude of grace? Oh, for the willingness to explore, to leave my tiny vocabulary at the entrance and stand before you naked, stripped of pretenses and rigidity, disrobed of self-righteousness and tidy packages, stripped of all that holds me at a distance from you and your world. Strip me, O God, then clothe me in curiosity and courage. The third part of our centering prayer practice, 20 minutes of actual meditation, is the heart of the practice. It's where we gently detach from pressing thoughts and feelings. Centering prayer is not talking to God, but listening to or listening for God. Keating has said, quote, "Silence is God's first language," unquote. And Bourgeau has said that centering prayer, quote, "is simply a wordless, trusting opening of self to the divine presence." Cynthia Bourgeault further describes the experience. Of course, it's difficult to put words around an experience that is deeply personal and intuitive. But in general, you're in the right ballpark if you sense your aim is to be totally open to God, totally available, all the way down to the innermost point of your being, deeper than your feeling, deeper than your thinking, deeper than your memories and desires, deeper than your usual psychological sense of yourself, even deeper than your presence. For ultimately, what will go on in this prayer is, quote, in secret, the words Jesus used in his instructions on prayer in Matthew chapter 6, verse 6. Deeper than even your conscious mind and your most bedrock sense of, I am here. Hidden even from yourself in that innermost sanctuary of your being, where, in the words of that well-loved monastic formula, your life is hidden with Christ in God. The basic technique for sitting in centering prayer is described by Keating. 1, choose a sacred word or phrase as the symbol of your intention to consent to God's presence and action within. I often use be still or just be. 2, sit comfortably and with eyes closed, settle briefly, and silently introduce the sacred word or phrase as the symbol of your intention to consent to God's presence and action within. And 3, when engaged with your thoughts, feelings, images, reflections, and body sensations, return ever so gently to the sacred word or phrase. And 4, at the end of the prayer period, remain in silence with eyes closed for a couple of minutes. And in my individual practice and in the group practice at St. James, we end centering prayer with a brief prayer reflection. The practice of centering prayer is to help us to be in the here and in the now, to be open to God's ever-presence, beyond language, through silence. By the way, we say practice because centering prayer is never exactly the way we want it to go or expect it to be, and it does take practice. There are days when it's really tough, when the mind is spinning with thoughts and feelings. This is not an uncommon occurrence. In one of Father Keating's training sessions, he was told by an attendee she was a failure because she had 10,000 thoughts in 20 minutes of meditation. His response was, how lovely, you've had 10,000 opportunities to return to God. And yes, it is about returning to God. To this point, as Bourgeault has noted, the method of centering prayer, quote, consists primarily of a repeated returning and refocusing of your intention, just as one repeatedly refocuses a camera lens that has drifted slightly off. Centering prayer, as I've mentioned, may be done by oneself or in a group. In terms of St. James' centering prayer group, the whole is definitely and incredibly greater than the sum of the parts. The shared interest and support on our spiritual journeys and the richness that comes from diversity of thought, feeling, experience, and perspective would be very hard to replicate. The group meets virtually, which, oddly as it may seem, has enhanced the practice. So in summary, what does centering prayer practice do for me? 1, it settles me when I feel unsettled. It's a reset to the here and now and on what is important. It's a touchstone that I can return to at other times of the day or week when my ego and automatic thought and feeling reflexes take control. 2, it opens my heart to deep feelings that I might otherwise not notice while I busy myself as a human doing rather than a human being. 3, it reminds me that I am not what I think or feel, or the composite of the various roles that I play, or the other emotional attachments to which I appear bound. 4, in the group setting, it challenges, energizes, and inspires me. And 5, above all, Centering prayer is helping me on my never-ending spiritual journey to understand what is God and who am I.
I recently returned from a Viking river cruise, booked through Germany to the Oberammergau Passion Play with an extension to Prague, along with friends. The trip started out on a bad note with delays to flights, changes in airports, and lost luggage for the entire trip. The first 10 days went well, although I did develop a cough. At the entrance to the Passion Play, I was diagnosed with COVID and banished from the grounds. The next day, I was transported to another hotel near Munich for COVID-diagnosed people and isolated for 6 days. My travel companions had to continue on with the rest of the trip. I had no personal contact with anyone except for the delivery lady with food and Lurch, the reception desk clerk. You know, we all know people who pay close attention to their mobile phones and always answer your call. I'm not that person. If I know where my phone is, I try to check it a couple times a day. Barbara Burton is my person. We frequently text regarding thrift shop, and she always answers my calls. Barbara had been in contact with me during the trip, asking if I'd gotten my luggage and how everything was going. Now, the longer I am in isolation, the more despondent I become. I'm bored, lonely, not understanding German TV, nothing much to read, not able to eat much, not drinking enough, feeling poorly, and scared. Now, 3 days in, I'm anxious because no one is checking on me, despite what I've been told that someone would be there 3 times a day. I started pouring out my troubles to Barb, and like the warrior she is, she contacts our thrift shop staff and church, requesting prayers for me, and offered support I so badly needed. Lurch is finally replaced by a more understanding desk clerk who finally schedules me for another COVID test the next day. Hooray, I'm negative. Viking schedules me to return home in 2 days. But by now, I'm suffering from such anxiety, dehydrated, and weak. All those worst-case scenarios you experience in the middle of the night are constantly circling in my head. Barb texts me. He's showing you that he's got you and will carry you all the way. Her pep talk cheered me, and I text, I lost my way and faith for a little while, and I thank you for your guidance. The morning I am leaving, she replies, praying for easy travels and safe return to the arms of your family. Prayer warriors at church are also helping. In capitals, angels will accompany you all the way home. My trip home was another nightmare, including collapsing in the middle of hundreds of people in the Munich airport. It's a long story and for another time. But Barbara was right. Angels appeared out of nowhere, dressed in airport personnel. Especially surprising, as there is such a labor shortage and it was so blatantly obvious. And they got me home. My luggage arrived 3 days later. Out of this experience, I learned that although I never saw any white robes, wings, or halos, there are definitely angels out there when you need them. It was a long recovery, but I made it back thanks to all the prayers of friends, church, family. And remember, who's in charge? Put your faith in Him.